Do you believe anyone truly escaped Alcatraz? Because tonight, we're stepping onto a rock in the middle of the freezing San Francisco Bay, where 3 men vanished into the dark, and the truth was buried under steel, salt water, and silence. The siren began at 11:42 p.m. Correctional Officer Clarence Doherty was making his routine count inside Cell House B of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary when he noticed something wrong in Cell 152. The shape under the blanket looked human. Motionless. Too still. He tapped the bars. No response. Another officer came. Then another. When they reached through the bars and nudged the inmate, the head rolled off the pillow and hit the concrete floor with a hollow crack. It wasn't a head. It was soap. Toothpaste. Toilet paper. Painted with flesh tones. Real human hair glued on top. The bed was empty. Within minutes, floodlights sliced across the prison yard. Armed guards flooded the corridors. Boats were dispatched into the black waters of the bay. The wind howled through the concrete like the prison itself was breathing. 3 men were gone. And no one had ever escaped from Alcatraz. The missing inmates were not petty criminals. They were bank robbers. Escape artists. Men who had already humiliated other prisons across America. Frank Morris. Brothers John and Clarence Anglin. Morris had an IQ reportedly in the genius range. He'd spent most of his life behind bars. The Anglin brothers were quiet, disciplined, and inseparable. Together, they had spent months planning something no one thought possible. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison. It was the end of the line. Sitting 1.25 miles off the coast of San Francisco, the island was surrounded by icy currents known to rip grown men under in seconds. The water temperature hovered around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Hypothermia could set in within minutes. Sharks weren't the real danger. The current was. The Bureau of Prisons had a saying, break the rules, and you go to Alcatraz. Break the rules there, and there's nowhere left to go. But Morris studied the prison like a scientist dissecting a specimen. He noticed the ventilation grates in their cells were crumbling from decades of salt air. Using stolen spoons from the mess hall, the men chipped away at the concrete night after night. They played music during recreation hour to mask the scraping. They created a makeshift drill out of a vacuum motor scavenged from the prison workshop. And no one noticed. Behind the walls of their cells, a hidden workshop took shape. Raincoats were stolen and stitched together into a crude life raft. Over 50 of them. Sewn by hand. Inflated by concertina-style bellows made from an accordion. Every night, they placed the dummy heads under their blankets and climbed through the holes they'd carved behind the vents. They crawled up plumbing pipes to the unused utility corridor above the cell house. They worked in darkness. And then, on June 11, 1962, they made their move. Investigators from the FBI arrived within hours. J. Edgar Hoover demanded results. The escape made international headlines. It embarrassed the entire federal prison system. Searchlights scanned the bay. Helicopters hovered. Patrol boats dragged the waters. On nearby Angel Island, fragments of rubber were discovered. A makeshift paddle. Scraps of raincoat material. But no bodies. No raft. No blood. Nothing that proved they drowned. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The official conclusion leaned toward death by drowning. The currents, the cold, it was impossible to survive. But then something surfaced that changed the tone of the investigation. A Chevrolet was reported stolen in Marin County the morning after the escape. The timing was precise. Too precise. Then came a postcard sent to the Anglin family in Florida. No return address. Just a message, we made it. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. Years later, Brazilian photographs surfaced showing 2 men resembling the Anglin brothers standing beside a termite mound on a rural farm. Facial recognition experts would later say the features were consistent. Consistent wasn't proof. But it wasn't coincidence either. Back in 1962, as FBI agents combed through the empty cells, one detail had been overlooked. Inside Frank Morris's cell, behind the vent, taped carefully into the darkness, was a scrap of paper. It wasn't a goodbye note. It was a tide chart. Marked. Circled. Timed perfectly to the minute they disappeared. And when investigators overlaid that chart with the current patterns in the bay, they realized something chilling. The men hadn't swum against the current. They had ridden it. Straight toward freedom. By dawn, the waters around Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary were thick with patrol boats. Search teams dragged grappling hooks across the bay floor. Divers descended into the freezing currents. Officially, the working theory was simple: no one survives that water. But the tide chart taped behind Frank Morris's vent told a different story. When FBI agents reconstructed the timing, they realized the escape had not been reckless. It had been mathematical. If the men had pushed off from the northeast side of the island just before midnight, precisely when the tide shifted, the current would not pull them out toward the Golden Gate and into the Pacific. It would carry them laterally, almost gently, toward the Marin headlands. It was no longer a suicide mission. It was a calculated crossing. The lead investigator, FBI Special Agent Robert Kennedy, no relation to the political dynasty, quietly admitted to his team that this might not be a recovery operation. It might be a manhunt. Within 24 hours of the escape, a blue Chevrolet was reported stolen in Marin County. The owner said it disappeared between midnight and 3 a.m. The timing was uncomfortable. The location even more so. Marin was exactly where the tide would have delivered 3 determined men on a raft made of prison raincoats. But there were no witnesses. No wet footprints. No discarded prison uniforms. Just silence. The Bureau combed through Morris's prison records. He had escaped from a Louisiana labor camp before. He had slipped through a reformatory in Florida. Every time, he was caught. But each attempt grew more sophisticated. The Anglin brothers were different. Raised in rural Georgia, they had grown up swimming in icy rivers. They were disciplined, patient, and intensely loyal to each other. Investigators began to suspect that Morris was the architect, but the Anglins were the muscle. And then came the first fracture in the official narrative. A week after the escape, a fisherman near the Marin shoreline reported seeing a piece of plywood with bits of rubber attached drifting in the reeds. It matched the material used in the raft fragments recovered near Angel Island. But it wasn't torn apart like wreckage. It looked deliberately cut. Then, in July, the Anglin family received a postcard at their home in Florida. The message was brief: "We made it. Safe. Don't worry." No return address. The handwriting resembled Clarence Anglin's, but forensic analysis couldn't confirm it. The Bureau dismissed it as a cruel prank. Yet the family insisted something else was happening. Every Mother's Day for the next 3 years, 2 tall women wearing heavy makeup and wigs sent flowers anonymously to the Anglin's mother. The flowers arrived without fail. The mother would later tell relatives she believed her boys were alive. Investigators called it wishful thinking. But privately, they reopened timelines. Then, in 1963, another strange report surfaced. A Brazilian farmer claimed 2 American men had approached him about work on his rural property. They were quiet, paid in cash, and avoided photographs. Years later, a snapshot emerged: 2 men standing beside a massive termite mound in Brazil. Facial recognition decades later would conclude the bone structure and facial ratios were highly consistent with John and Clarence Anglin. Still not proof. But still not drowning. Meanwhile, back at the prison, the fallout was catastrophic. The escape humiliated the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was already expensive to operate. Supplies had to be shipped in daily. The infrastructure was decaying. Public confidence cracked. Less than a year later, in 1963, the government announced the prison would close. Officially, it was cost-related. Unofficially, many believed 3 missing men had sealed its fate. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't publicized at the time. During a later review of prison materials, investigators realized a 4th inmate had been involved in the planning, Alan West. He had helped widen the ventilation holes but claimed he couldn't escape because his opening wasn't large enough that night. He told authorities the others left without him. West cooperated fully. He described the raft, the timing, the route. But there was one detail he never mentioned, one that would surface decades later when tide simulation experts ran computer models using historical 1962 current data. If the men launched even 30 minutes later than planned, the current would have pulled them not toward Marin, but directly toward the city shoreline of San Francisco itself. And when analysts mapped that alternate landing point, they found something chilling. It was less than 2 miles from a bus depot operating overnight routes out of state. Meaning if they hit land there, they wouldn't need to steal a car. They could have disappeared by sunrise. The FBI officially closed the case in 1979, concluding the men likely drowned. The U.S. Marshals quietly reopened it years later, following new leads. Because no bodies were ever found. No confirmed deaths. No confessions. Just 3 empty beds, 3 handmade heads staring at the ceiling, and a tide chart marked with precision. And then, in 2013, more than 50 years after the escape, the San Francisco Police Department received a letter. It claimed to be from Frank Morris. It began with 5 words that reignited everything. "My name is Frank Morris." The letter arrived at the San Francisco Police Department in 2013, postmarked but untraceable, written in shaky handwriting on lined paper. The sender claimed he was 83 years old. He said he had cancer. And he said something no one expected. "I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother John and Clarence Anglin. Yes, we all made it that night." For over 50 years, the official story had been simple. The 3 men drowned in the icy waters beneath Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. No bodies meant no closure, but the Bureau maintained it was the only logical outcome. The letter shattered that logic. According to the writer, the raft worked. The tide carried them exactly where planned. They reached the northern shore before dawn, cold but alive. A car had been arranged in advance. They drove through the night. He claimed John Anglin died in 2008. Clarence in 2011. Morris said he had been living under a different name for decades, moving between states, eventually ending up in Southern California. He offered a deal: if authorities publicly announced they would not pursue him and guaranteed medical treatment, he would reveal his location. It sounded almost cinematic. A dying mastermind stepping out of the shadows. The FBI, though officially closed on the case since 1979, quietly reopened its files. The U.S. Marshals, who had inherited jurisdiction, ran forensic tests on the letter. DNA. Fingerprints. Handwriting comparison against prison records. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. The DNA was too degraded for certainty. The handwriting had similarities, but after half a century, age could alter anyone's script. There was no smoking gun. But there was one detail in the letter that unsettled investigators. The writer described the raft's landing spot with striking precision, not just Marin County, but a narrow stretch of rocky shoreline west of the bridge, shielded from the strongest crosscurrents. When modern tidal experts ran simulations using 1962 current data, that landing zone aligned almost perfectly with the most favorable survival window. It was information only someone who studied the currents deeply, or experienced them, would know. Then came another twist. A retired federal agent reviewing old case materials noticed something buried in archived interviews. In the days after the escape, a nearby boat operator reported seeing a small, low-profile craft moving in the dark, without lights, heading north. At the time, it was dismissed as unrelated. Too vague. Too uncertain. But paired with the tide data and the stolen car report, it formed a fragile but plausible chain. And then there were the Brazil photographs. In the 1970s, a family friend claimed to have met two American brothers on a farm in rural Brazil. Years later, a photo surfaced, two men standing beside a towering termite mound, older but strikingly similar to the Anglins. Facial recognition specialists decades later concluded there was a high probability match. Not proof beyond doubt. But not fantasy either. By then, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary had transformed from maximum security nightmare to tourist landmark. Millions walked its corridors every year, standing inside cell 152, staring at the vent hole widened by stolen spoons. Guides often told visitors, no one ever escaped. But the truth was softer. More careful. No one was ever proven to have survived. The difference matters. Because if Morris and the Anglins did make it, they didn't just escape a prison. They outwitted one of the most secure facilities in American history. They embarrassed the Bureau of Prisons. They possibly triggered the closure of the institution itself in 1963. And they vanished without a trace in an age long before digital footprints. The 2013 letter ended with a line that still unsettles investigators. If you announce on TV that you promise I will only serve 1 year and get medical attention, I will write back to let you know exactly where I am. Authorities never made that announcement. No second letter ever arrived. Frank Morris, if alive in 2013, would be well over 90 today. The Anglin brothers, if they survived as long as claimed, are gone. But here's the twist that refuses to die. In 2020, advanced tidal modeling conducted by independent researchers concluded that under the exact conditions recorded on June 11, 1962, survival was not only possible, it was probable. Meaning the impossible prison may have been beaten by timing, patience, and 3 men who understood that the ocean isn't just a barrier. It's a highway, if you know when to enter. So what do you believe? Did they drown in the freezing currents of San Francisco Bay? Or did 3 shadows slip through history, living quiet lives under new names while the world declared them dead? Because somewhere between official reports and unanswered letters, between tide charts and termite mound photographs, lies a truth that was never locked behind bars. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one.